This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Kelsey Bentley, K-State Extension Small Ruminant Specialist, begins the show as she explains Scrapie in goats and sheep. She says what programs producers can be involved in to help with eradication and traceability. K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth continues the show as he says what damage bean leaf beetles and podworms are doing to the soybean crop. Jeff also mentions what control options are available. Ending the show is K-State Extension horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd with an update on the latest pest concerns for the home garden and landscape. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our show discussing Scrapie with K-State Small Ruminant Specialist Kelsey Bentley. Kelsey, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Kelsey, when we're thinking about Scrapie for our small ruminants, what is it?
So Scrapie is going to be a fatal neurological disease that occurs within both sheep and goats that's going to be caused by something called a prion. And a prion is essentially just an abnormally folded protein that causes neurological disease. So I know that in some of other species that are maybe a little bit more common to those that aren't in the small ruminant industries, you can think of BSE or mad cow disease, along with CWD or chronic wasting disease within bovine and deer respectively. So this is just a prion disease that just so happens to impact small ruminants. I will say, unlike BSE or mad cow disease, there is very little human health risk. And so there's no evidence that classical Scrapie can transfer over and infect people. So there's less of that risk there with our small ruminants, but still it is technically within that kind of family of diseases.
You mentioned classical Scrapie. Are there different types of Scrapie?
There are technically. So there's some classical forms of Scrapie, and then I can go down the list of there's lots of different prion diseases that can occur. Traditionally, when we're thinking about testing for Scrapie, though, we are scanning for some form of classical Scrapie disease. Now, while I say that, there's a lot of them, and we can kind of go into the weeds on that if you really want to. But for the most part, I think that when we think of Scrapie that is going to impact small ruminants, it's going to be the first form of Scrapie that was the most detrimental to the United States, and that was classical.
Has there been a recent case nowhere near Kansas that has come up when it comes to Scrapie?
Kansas producers should not be alarmed by this case that was reported. It was actually found in, I believe, July 31st of this year in Oregon. And so we have not had any cases here in Kansas here probably within the last 10 years. I do know that the last reported case would have been back in 2021, and that also was a sheep. And so just to give you a little bit of the eradication timeline for the U.S. to be considered eradicated, or there's no longer Scrapie within our production system, we would have to be cleared for a period of 7 years. So going back to that 2021 screening, you can see we were really, really close to getting on the cusp of being considered this an eradicated disease. And the reason that is because our government and the USDA and APHIS has done such a good job of implementing programs. So back in the 50s and the 60s, Scrapie was a completely different beast. It was wiping out complete flocks. They were having to do total depopulation of flocks and herds. Now We've implemented things like genetic testing, where we can have individuals that are genetically more resistant to that prion disease and are more resistant to classical scrapie. And so, therefore, the likelihood of sheep and goats within Kansas experiencing scrapie is very, very slim. But it's still important for us to make sure that we're keeping accurate measures, right, to keep up good biosecurity and ensure that we're doing appropriate EID and traceability even for things outside of scrapie. I'll give New World screwworm as a really good example of if something were to break in Kansas, the scrapie system or that EID system and premise ID is a really good way for our public health officials to be able to trace back to certain flocks and for us to have a better understanding of where disease outbreaks have occurred.
For those premise IDs, how should producers truly be utilizing them?
Yeah, so if you have a closed flock and you are maybe not interested in selling seed stock producers, or you're just not interested in having sheep go off your flock, except for when they are going to be harvested, you would then just need to make sure that any lamb or goat that leaves your premise would have some form of that Scrapie tag with your premise ID on that tag. So that would just be at time of when they are leaving your flock. So technically, producers don't have to implement any form of tagging system outside of just when we go to take those lambs to sell or when we go to take those lambs for processing. Now, I am going to plug that I think record keeping is really important, and I would like to see all producers have that tag in earlier than that. I think that we can maybe make some true progress and good decision making if we know what individuals maybe are gaining better, or we understand what individuals are maybe more prone to parasitic challenge. So I'm going to plug that I think that that EID tag should go in before. I think we should have that kind of done as a processing at lambing and kidding, and that way we can kind of better track that individual throughout their lifespan. However, technically, no animal that is currently on your farm has to have that tag until we either sell them off as some sort of a seed stock or you lamb right to a different producer, or we send them through some sort of a sale barn or traditional markets.
Coming back to that national scrapie eradication program, with the recent case, do we have to reset the timeline?
Yes. So technically, with that recent case, there's been some groaning from producers because it does reset that timeline for us. That is something that kind of, as a World Health Organization, it's important for us to make sure that we have zero traceability of scrapie or zero detection of scrapie within that 7-year timeline. And the reason for that is, unlike bacterial or viral diseases, prions are extremely resistant to environment, and there is no treatment or vaccine for scrapie. So while the 7 years seems extreme, we have to remember prion diseases can just, they linger, and they also take time to be kind of rear their ugly head. So this sheep that was actually just screened potentially wasn't even showing clinical signs of disease, right? This was just a sheep that potentially was going to be harvested, and they just so happened to do some traceability and testing of that individual, and they discovered scrapie. So really, really, while, we're not seeing the nasty effects of scrapie like we were back when it was bad and it was killing sheep, it's still important to know that it can go back to that, right? If we don't make sure that we are fully eradicated. And with just the timeline of scrapie and how long it takes for there to be clinical symptoms, that 7-year period is kind of mandatory.
You had mentioned some USDA programs, APHIS programs. Are those things Kansas producers can be involved in?
Yes, absolutely. So if Kansas producers aren't currently having premise IDs and they're not currently registered with any form of identification, they can just type in the National Scrapie Eradication Program, and they can readily find where they can register their flock with a premise ID, and they can then receive those tags. There is a fee associated with those tags. Still, however, I think it's something that every single producer in Kansas should do. And once again, if you are marketing, so back in the olden days, I believe before like 2019 or something like that, if you just took lambs to the sale barn or goats to the sale barn, you could technically get away with not having any form of identification in their ear. What happens now is if you take those same lambs or goats without some form of identification in their ear, the sale barn is going to charge an additional fee or kind of a yardage fee on top of that for the tag. So you're going to pay for the tag one way or another. And I always tell producers that the sale barn or wherever you're marketing your lambs is normally going to charge you more for that. So why wouldn't you go ahead and just register your flock, have some premise IDs on hand? And so that way, if we are going to ship off lambs, we can just pop that tag in their ear and send them on their way.
If people are going to find out more information about this, what's your recommendation?
I would say more than likely look up USDA resources like that National Scrapie Eradication Program. There's specific guides. So if you type in Scrapie Tags, you will see a guide as to ordering those tags and then also some best biosecurity practices for your flock.
Kelsey, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was Kansas State University Extension Small Ruminant Specialist Kelsey Bentley as she talked about Scrapie in the United States of America. She also mentioned how sheep and goat producers can be a part of the National Scrapie Eradication Program. If you're looking to find more information about that program or about Scrapie in general, I will link a couple of websites in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Also in the show notes, you will find a link for the upcoming cow-calf mineral management field day taking place Tuesday, August 11th from 5 to 7 near Manhattan, Kansas that we talked about with K-State cow-calf extension specialist Jason Warner. If you are looking to attend, they do ask that you RSVP by today, August 6th. As mentioned, it will be linked in today's show notes, or you can also find it for yourself by going to ksubeef.org. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about bean leaf beetles and soybean podworms with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Jeff, as we talk about bean leaf beetles and soybean podworms, is this something crop growers are seeing in their fields?
Well, we're going to. I've been getting a lot of questions as actually a lot of the sorghum is in the whorl stage. The worms that cause ragworm on sorghum and can get in corn. In another 2 weeks, they'll be transitioning out and they'll be flying over looking for soybeans to lay eggs on. So that's the podworms. They can be corn earworms. They can be armyworms. They can be fall armyworms. Any of these kind of worms that actually get in soybeans and feed on the pods are just generally called podworms. But right now, what most folks are worried about are bean leaf beetles. As the soybeans come into August, generally the agronomist has always told us August is the time when you make yield, so you want timely rains, you want to keep the pests off, all that kind of stuff. And there's been quite a bit of spraying going on or pesticide applications in soybeans in the last week or so for fungicides. And a lot of the growers are asking if they put a little insecticide in with the fungicide, because it saves an application cost if they mix them together and just do one, if that's a good idea. And that will help get rid of podworms. That will help get rid of, any pests that are potentially out in the soybean fields. But my recommendation is don't do it. We generally only recommend treating with a herbicide or an insecticide or whatever when it is needed, when it is called for. And so just because you have a fungus in your field and you're spraying, If you put an insecticide in there, that insecticide will go out. It'll be, spread nice evenly across the soybeans. But if there aren't any pests there, it won't do you any good. And you got about 10 to 14 days with that insecticide out there, just is not killing anything, and then it'll dissipate and won't be any good. The target organisms generally are the podworms and the bean leaf beetles. The bean leaf beetles right now, for the most part, at least what I've seen in the last week, are in the larval stage, or the pupal stage. So they're in the soil, they're feeding around the root systems. That's something you need to look out for if you're looking out in your soybean field and you see what the growers call a weak spot in the field, or a spot in the field where it looks like the beans aren't growing as well as other places. Go out and pull up some of those plants and examine the roots. Chances are they've got little white worms feeding on them, or they have had little white worms feeding on them. So it's the larval stage of the bean leaf beetle. It's just like the larval stage of the corn rootworm. They feed on the roots of soybean plants, whereas corn rootworms feed on the roots of corn plants. They look very much alike. They're little white worms. They feed on the root hairs and the roots, and they interrupt, food and water transmission up the plant. So the plants will start wilting a little bit if you have the larval stage feeding on them. So go out there and look. It doesn't do any good. If you spray right now with insecticide, it's not going to get into the soil where the larvae are feeding. So they're going to pupate, and another week, 10 days, they're going to come out as adults. And those adults, then, the thing I worry about, the second generation of the bean leaf beetle, the adults, they will feed a little bit on leaf tissue, but they're not going to hurt anything because of that feeding. But oftentimes, as our soybeans start to produce pods, those pods are nice, young, green, succulent, and the adult bean leaf beetle will go and start feeding on the pods. Also, in 2 to 3 weeks, the podworms that, like I said, are now feeding in corn and or sorghum, as they come out and they fly around, lay eggs, and the eggs hatch, those larvae will crawl in. If they're in soybeans, they'll crawl in the soybeans, and they will start feeding on the pods. I don't know why the pods are more attractive to these insects, but they are. They will feed on the leaves if there aren't any pods, but for the most part, they will go to the pods. Now, the important part, if you spray an insecticide and it's out there for 2 weeks, it's going to dissipate. It's not going to have any more. It's not going to be toxic to these larvae or the bean leaf beetles as they're feeding. So it's not going to have done you any good. So that's what I'm saying. It's all a matter of timing. You want to make sure the insects are there before you actually put out the insecticide. So the bean leaf beetle is going to feed on the pod, and the bean leaf beetle adult is going to feed on the pod from now until there are no more green pods in that field. So once the beans start setting pods, they'll be out there and they'll feed from now till September, October, whenever those indeterminate beans quit putting out green pods, they will feed on the pod. The podworm, whether it's a corn earworm, armyworm, whatever it is, the larvae, they are going to crawl up the plant and they're going to feed on the seed or the bean inside the pod. So if you're out looking in your field, once you start setting pods and you have a hole right where there's a bean or where a bean was, or you have 2 or 3, that's the podworm. That's not the bean leaf beetle adult. So it's important you distinguish the two, because the podworms are only going to be out there feeding for 2 weeks. The larval stage is the only feeding stage of a podworm. So after 10 days, 2 weeks of feeding, they're going to crawl down and they're going to pupate in the soil. So if you've sprayed it ahead of time, you've missed them. If you spray it after that 2-week period, you've missed it. So you're just wasting that application. So that's why I say timing is very, very important. Whereas the bean leaf beetle is going to be out there feeding on the pods. They don't necessarily feed on the seed, they just feed on the pod. But that pod feeding, it can open up the pod so that the bean inside or the seed inside, the marketable product, it can dry out or it can fall out or get a disease or something can happen to it. So you're reducing the marketability of the soybean overall, of the soybean plant overall. So that's why it's very critical in the next, actually in August, in the next 2 or 3 weeks, to get out and monitor your soybean fields. If you have a treatment threshold for the podworms, it's generally about 1 per row foot. It doesn't take very many because they're feeding right on the marketable product. And one worm, they can feed on several different pods. They may not eat all 3 seeds out of the pod. They may go from one pod to another. And when they're doing that, they're opening up those pods, which is ruining the marketable bean inside the pod anyway. So 1 per row foot, but you want to make sure they're small. You want to catch them while they're small. Once they've gotten to be, mature larvae, they're going to quit feeding. They're going to crawl down. They're going to get in the soil and they're going to pupate. And they're going to take 3 or 4 weeks to pupate. And then they're going to take 3 or 4 weeks to come out as an adult. They're going to mate. Those adults are going to fly around, lay eggs. Those eggs are going to hatch. So it's going to be 2 to 3 weeks down the road before there are any larvae that you're going to kill. So if you have new beans, double crop beans or something like that coming on, that's when you need to get out and look at those. So it's really a matter of timing. One of the problems with bean leaf beetles, there are 2 different color phases of the adult. One's a tan color phase and the other's kind of a pink or red color phase. The tan color phase is often misidentified with adult southern corn rootworms. The southern corn rootworms can be in soybean fields by the thousands. And so a lot of times guys get out and look and they think those are adult bean leaf beetles, and they can feed a little bit on leaf tissue, but not much. But they still get concerned. And adult southern corn rootworm only feeds on pollen. They're not going to feed on the pods. They're not going to feed on the beans. They won't feed much on leaf tissue. They're just feeding on pollens. They're just there when the plants are shedding pollen. So they're going to leave. So make sure you properly identify whether it's a bean leaf beetle or the southern corn rootworm that's adult that's out in the field. But those are the 2 pests that we generally worry about. We will have some problems with them throughout the state in the next month. So just be aware, spraying in a timely fashion can help, but spraying if the pests aren't there is just not going to help at all. So that's kind of the situation in the coming 2 to 3 weeks in August as far as soybeans go.
Do you ever see these pests go to other crop fields, or are they just specifically in soybeans?
The bean leaf beetle will stay in soybeans in the fall. They will move out and they will go to overwintering sites. Lots of times bean leaf beetles overwinter in alfalfa. So when you get out and sweep alfalfa in the fall or in the late winter, early spring, sometimes you'll pick up quite a few adult bean leaf beetles. The podworms, they will feed on soybeans, armyworms, fall armyworms, cornerworms. They'll feed on just about any green plant tissue. They can be a problem in corn. They can be a problem in soybeans. They can be a problem in sorghum. They can be a problem in cotton. And some of them, like the armyworm and the fall armyworm, can be a problem in wheat. As when we plant wheat again in the fall, the armyworms will still be around. The fall armyworms, they don't overwinter in Kansas, so they will pretty much head out every year's a little different, but mid-October. But the armyworms will remain behind, and they can be a problem in early planted wheat. The corn earworm, again, they don't overwinter in Kansas either, so they'll feed in soybeans, sorghum. Pretty much as the sorghum dries up, or the sorghum and the soybeans dry up, the corn earworms will go someplace for overwintering also, and just leaving the armyworms around. But they're all pretty much have a wide host range and feed on just about any green succulent plant tissue that they can find.
Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure, anytime.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd is our guest this week for our Lawn and Garden segment, and there's a lot to cover. Bagworms are getting larger, making chemical control much less effective than earlier in the summer. Japanese beetle adult activity peaks right through August, and there are a variety of vegetable pests to be scouting for. Raymond, let's start off with an update on bagworms. Where do we stand right now?
Well, they're out there, and they're getting bigger by the day. So let's start off basically with the fundamentals. When they're about a quarter inch to an eighth of an inch, which some areas they are, then they're more susceptible to the spray applications we commonly recommend, like BTK, which is known as Bacillus thuringiensis kurostaki. It's a bacteria. And then the other one is spinosad, commonly in Captain Jack's dead bug brew. Both of those are stomach poison, so they have to eat it. So when they're young, they don't have to eat as much, and they're killed much quicker. When they get bigger, then those two materials are not an option. You can hand remove and put them in soapy water and kill them, or you can use one of the pyrethroid insecticides like bifenthrin. The problem with that is it kills all the beneficials. And so the more you can do in the front end by spraying when you see the small bags, an eighth to a quarter of an inch, the more likely you're going to have a high mortality and your plants are not going to suffer substantial damage.
So really get out there and check the trees now.
You should do that for every insect, is go out and check and see what's going on because everything's contingent on weather conditions.
In terms of Japanese beetles, they're active as well?
They are, but we're seeing a decline. Right now, the females will be looking for places to lay eggs, moist turf grass or moist soil, and then you'll get the grub stage or larva. And then in the August, September, then there'll be a turf pest. If you did apply your preventative insecticide, that will help. But if you didn't, then you run the risk of damage, especially if you have irrigated turf. And your options are limited. The only one that you probably will be able to use is Dilox because it works on the third instar grubs, whereas the other materials don't. So it doesn't last as long, but it will kill late instar grubs and hopefully minimize damage to the turf grass.
In terms of vegetable pests, there's quite a few.
Yes, we are in that era. We're into July. Squash bugs are abundant. We're seeing eggs. We're seeing nymphs and adults. We also have the blister beetles, both the 3-line and the ash gray, feeding on chard, eggplant. We also have the flea beetles feeding on eggplant and other plants in the Solanaceae family, tomato and pepper. And then we have harlequin bugs feeding on horseradish and some other ones. So if you see those, you can do hand remove them, except for blister beetles. You want to wear gloves because they do give off a material called cantharidin, which can burn your skin. But sometimes the easiest way is just go out there and hand pick them, put them in soapy water, and they'll kill them. Spray applications may not work because the adults have a thickened cuticle, a skin, that may impede the penetration of the insecticide into the insect and consequently won't kill them.
Always want to be careful when we're working in the garden, right?
Yes, but you also want to scout, like we mentioned earlier, for these pests. And when you see them, first I would do the hand picking, high-pressure water spray, dislodge them, and if need be, insecticides. And I would contact your extension agent about what materials they would recommend for the various insect and even mite pests, because two-spotted spider mite is another one that'll be on tomatoes as we get warmer weather.
I was going to say, anything else that might be showing up in mid-August to September?
That would be the two-spotted spider mite. That's our warm, hot season mite, and they attack a wide variety of both ornamentals and vegetable plants, tomatoes, peppers, and so those you can basically, a high-pressure water spray will dislodge them, and then there are some miticides or materials that you can use or acaricides to manage them. But the issue is you've got to get thorough coverage of all plant parts, especially leaf undersides, because that's where they reside.
And extension publications available really on all of these pests.
I think we have extension publications on most of these: harlequin bug, squash bug, blister beetles, Japanese beetle, bagworms. We don't have one yet for flea beetle, but we pretty much have almost all of them, yeah.
That's K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd with information on bagworms, Japanese beetles, and vegetable pests. For more information, contact your local K-State Extension office. Horticultural publications are available online through the Extension Bookstore. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Whitworth. This is the K-State Radio Network.